Chapter 17. Crime and Punishment. Anatoly Alexandrov, the 83-year-old veteran of the Soviet nuclear industry and chief academic advisor to the creators of the Chernobyl-type RBMK reactors, resigned as president of the Soviet Academy of Sciences on October 16, 1986. He was also ready to leave his post as director of the Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy. The all-important first page of the history of the Soviet nuclear program had been turned. The next page depended on who would succeed Alexandrov as director in charge of 10,000 scholars and employees. Alexandrov looked to his first deputy at the institute, Valery Legasov, as a possible successor. But others thought differently. The battle for the directorship began soon after Alexandrov's resignation, when a large group of the institute's top scientists mobilized to prevent Legasov from moving into the director's office. They struck in the spring of 1987 during routine elections to the institute's main governing body, the Academic Council. Voting against allowing Legasov to join the council were 129 senior members of the institute. It was a devastating blow to the first deputy director, who had become used to running the institute while Alexandrov was busy at the Academy of Sciences. Only 100 of his colleagues supported him. Legasov was a romanticist. He wrote poetry. In fact, in early youth he had aspired to become a professional writer, but had been dissuaded by Konstantin Simonov, a leading Soviet literary figure. At the time, students argued about who was more important to the country, physicists or lyric poets. In 1959, the prominent poet Boris Slutsky had written in one of his poems, "Somehow physicists are in vogue, somehow lyric poets are kept down," and proceeded to conclude that physicists were more important to society than those engaged in the humanities. Party ideologues who monitored the extensive discussion that followed the publication of Slutsky's poem offered a compromise. Both were important. Legasov, a chemist by training, strove to pursue both callings. Like Nikita Khrushchev, Stalin's successor at the top of the Soviet power pyramid, and an architect of the ideological thaw that allowed discussions like the one about physicists and lyric poets to take place in a society traumatized by Stalin's purges, Legasov was a believer. Both believed in the Soviet system. Legasov had manifested his belief by joining the Communist Party while still a student at Moscow University, an act that many of his apolitical colleagues considered naive or careerist. The Soviet scientific community would produce some leading political dissidents, including the physicists Andrei Sakharov and Yuri Orlov. During the Russian Revolution, Legasov's boss, Alexandrov, had fought for 2 years in Ukraine in the ranks of the White Army. He had joined the party only at the age of 59, when that was absolutely necessary if he was to become director of the institute established by Kurchatov. Many scholars had no sympathy for the regime and kept their distance from the party, whereas Legasov embraced its rules and ideals. Legasov also believed in the power of Soviet science and the safety of the nuclear reactors produced with the help of his institute. Only 2 years before the Chernobyl disaster, he went on record to support them, writing, "It is safe to say that nuclear power is considerably less harmful to human health than coal power, which is equally potent. Specialists are, of course, well aware that it is impossible to produce an actual nuclear explosion at a nuclear power station, and only an improbable concatenation of circumstances could bring about the semblance of such an explosion, which would be no more destructive than an artillery shell." It appeared that Legasov was blindly following the party and industry line. His belief in the safety of reactors came with his post as deputy to Alexandrov. Yevgeny Velichov, Legasov's colleague and competitor both at the institute and on the site of the Chernobyl accident, would later recall that Legasov had no involvement in the construction of the reactor or inside knowledge of its physics. One physicist called him a boy from the chemical periphery. Legasov promoted RBMK reactors in his official capacity as first deputy of the Institute's director. As at the Institute, On the site of the Chernobyl accident, Legasov was in the forefront, manifesting not only his belief in the system, but also his leadership qualities and readiness for self-sacrifice. Legasov was the only competent person there, said a Ukrainian colleague, remembering Legasov's days in Chernobyl. He poked around everywhere. In the early days he spent time on the bookcase, the exhaust pipe that remained intact after the explosion. Like everyone else, he was afraid of radiation, but he had to have the moral right to send others there, so he first went himself. Legasov soon realized that the whole Soviet Union was facing a disaster of global proportions. At stake was the future of millions of people, if not of the entire world. Without much hesitation, he put his own health and life on the line to save others. Like many who would come to Chernobyl with him and in his wake, Legasov did not understand the full extent of the risks he faced, but he would grasp them more quickly and completely than anyone else. Legasov would compare the situation created by the nuclear accident with that of World War II, as did many others at the Chernobyl power station. But his comparisons with the Great Patriotic War, as the Soviet-German conflict was known in the USSR, which had been highly mythologized by Soviet propaganda, went beyond the self-sacrifice shown by Red Army soldiers and Chernobyl liquidators. He would also talk about the unpreparedness of the Soviet system to deal with both disasters, the nuclear accident and the military catastrophe of the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941. There was such lack of preparation at the plant, recalled Legasov, such disorder, such fright, as in 41, exactly. 1941, but in an even worse version, with the same brist, the same courage, the same desperation, but also with the same unreadiness. The latter reference was to the heroic defense of the Brest fortress in western Belarus by Red Army soldiers during the first weeks of the German invasion. As the chief scientific advisor in Chernobyl in the critical days immediately after the accident, Legasov was responsible for many key decisions made by the government commission. One of them was his proposal to bury the reactor under thousands of tons of sand, clay and lead. The task was achieved at the cost of the health and ultimately the lives of helicopter pilots, but some of Legasov's colleagues considered the whole exercise nothing but a waste of lives and resources. The mound of sand over the reactor's burning mouth did nothing to decrease radiation levels, and many believed that it increased the danger of the reactor overheating and melting down a second time. Legasov would defend his decisions to the end, but Chernobyl not only devastated his body, he sustained the maximum dose permitted by Soviet regulations, 25 Roentgens, many times over, but also burdened his mind with disturbing thoughts about his role in endangering the health and lives of others. Legasov's work on the report that he delivered in Vienna in August 1986 lifted his spirits and made him believe that he could improve the safety of Soviet nuclear power plants. But his reception in Moscow upon his return was devastating. Officialdom was unhappy. He had gone too far in divulging the secrets of the Soviet nuclear program. Not only were party leaders dissatisfied, but even more important, so were his bosses in the nuclear industry and his colleagues at the Kurchatov Institute. The latter were angry with Legasov, feeling that he had betrayed them. Legasov, for his part, believed that he had done the right thing for his country and the world. Privately, he began to regret that he had not gone far enough. He would later tell his friends, "I told the truth in Vienna, but not the whole truth." In his report, Legasov had blamed the accident almost exclusively on the faults and errors of those in charge of the plant. He had not spoken about the defects of the reactor itself, which helped to turn what would otherwise have been a serious accident into a nuclear catastrophe. That was one more burden on his conscience. Officially, Legasov had sustained 100 rem of radiation, but neither he nor his doctors knew the actual extent of his exposure. At Chernobyl, when he went to the most dangerous areas of the plant, he often left his dosimeter behind. He began to feel the first symptoms of disease that summer as he prepared his report for the Vienna conference. In November 1986, he was invited to join Politburo members atop the Lenin Mausoleum during the Red Square Parade, marking the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, one of the highest honors ever to be bestowed on a Soviet scientist. But his health was already so compromised that he could not attend. Legasov's wife, Margarita, began to record his symptoms in a medical diary: nausea, headaches, exhaustion. Tests showed an increase of white cells in his blood, a sign of the suppression of bone marrow activity and acute radiation sickness. In May 1987, doctors found myelocytes in Legasov's bloodstream, young cells that were supposed to be in the bone marrow but had now gotten into his blood, indicating the risk of developing cancer. With his health deteriorating and his spirits at an all-time low after his colleagues refused to elect him to the Kurchatov Institute's academic council, Legasov checked into a hospital for the treatment of his radiation sickness. In despair, he decided to end his life by overdosing on sleeping pills. Only the vigilance of the medical personnel saved his life. Doctors pumped his stomach before the sleeping pills could kill him. Legasov would try to consign Chernobyl to the past and start his life anew. It was easier said than done. As Legasov underwent treatment in a Moscow hospital, the managers of the Chernobyl nuclear plant, whom the Politburo deemed solely responsible for the nuclear disaster, a judgment that Legasov had announced to the world in Vienna, went on trial. It was decided to hold the trial in Chernobyl itself, in the heart of the 30-kilometer exclusion zone. The formal reason for that decision was a Soviet legal provision requiring trials to be held in the place where the alleged crime had been committed. Law or no law, it was a very strange choice. Levels of radiation in Chernobyl were still extremely high. Although asphalt had been removed from roads and sidewalks and then buried, radioactivity was everywhere, especially on the shoulders of the newly built roads. In the town centre, journalists could see permanently installed dosimeters. Anyone entering the building in which the trial was taking place had first to wash his footwear in containers of water placed near the entrance. The security regime established in the exclusion zone helped the authorities to exercise complete control over what was happening in the building where the trial took place and its vicinity. The hall of the local cultural centre was turned into a makeshift courtroom by fitting the windows with metal bars, separating the stage from the seating area with a curtain, and removing rows of seats. The room had a seating capacity of 200 and was always full. Operators and other personnel of the nuclear plant attended the proceedings when they were not otherwise occupied. One of them, Nikolai Karpan, made notes that he would publish years later. The trial lasted 18 days, from July the 7th to the 29th, 1987, with journalists permitted to attend only on 2 of them. On the opening day, they listened to the prosecutor's statement. On the closing day, they heard the verdict. The journalists quipped that it was an open trial in a closed zone. 6 managers and safety officers of the Chernobyl nuclear plant were put on trial for violation of safety rules and negligence of duty. The defendants included the former director of the plant, Viktor Brukhanov, the former chief engineer, Nikolai Fomin, and Fomin's deputy, Anatoly Dyatlov, who, on the morning of April the 26th, had overseen the shutdown of Unit 4 that led to the explosion. They were the prime suspects, arrested long before the trial, and now seated at the same desk in the center of the room. The other defendants, the chief of the reactor division of the plant, Oleksiy Kovalenko, the chief of the plant shift on the night when the accident occurred, Boris Rogoshkin, and an official of the Nuclear Safety Administration, Yuri Laushkin, were seated separately. Viktor Brukhanov, the principal defendant, was not at all surprised to find himself on trial. His first thought on seeing Unit 4 destroyed by the explosion had been about going to prison. Long experience as a Soviet industrial manager had taught him that the first to be blamed for any large-scale accident was the director, and if the accident was serious enough, the director would go to jail. The Politburo decision of July 1986 to expel him from the Communist Party for major errors and shortcomings in work leading to an accident with serious consequences, had opened the door to his arrest. The KGB officer who ordered Brukhanov's arrest in August had told him that he was better off in prison. The scope of the disaster had shocked the public, which was looking for scapegoats, and the former director of the plant was an easy target. During one of Brukhanov's interrogations, a KGB officer unknown to him entered the room and said, "I would shoot you myself." Brukhanov responded, "Well, go ahead, stand me up and shoot." By that point, he was ready for almost anything. Brukhanov had already spent almost a year in the KGB prison in Kiev. Only after his arrest had he been examined by doctors, who told him that he had sustained approximately 250 rem, 10 times the dose allowed the liquidators. Brukhanov suffered from acute radiation syndrome, and was no stranger to regular headaches and attacks of excruciating pain behind the ears. He spent most of the pre-trial months in solitary confinement, the worst kind of imprisonment imaginable. Only once was he allowed to see his wife, Valentina. The family, which included a teenage son and an older daughter who had given birth to a baby girl 4 months after the Chernobyl accident, was suffering a stunning reversal of fortune. Previously one of the most respected families in Pripyat, the Brukhanovs were now shunned by many of their former friends and neighbors. After the emergency evacuation of Pripyat, they had almost no possessions. Not until August, after Brukhanov's arrest, was Valentina allowed to visit their apartment in Pripyat and take a few of their belongings. The dosimetrist went in first, she recalled. He gave permission to take a few items and books. We cleaned every volume with a cloth soaked in a weak vinegar solution. It was thought to counteract radiation. To make things worse, the court authorities froze Brukhanov's bank account, to which he had transferred his monthly salary and vacation pay prior to his arrest. Valentina concealed the fact of her husband's arrest from their daughter, who was breastfeeding her baby. To support herself and her teenage son, Valentina returned to work at the Chernobyl nuclear plant, helping to run the remaining reactors, which went back on stream in the fall of 1986. She was allowed to work without weekend breaks and holidays, because she wanted to keep busy to avoid thinking about the disaster and what now awaited her and her husband. The strategy backfired. Valentina's blood pressure climbed dangerously high, and one day her colleagues called an ambulance to take her to the hospital. Valentina had to seek various ways of coping with the stress and trauma of Chernobyl. Eventually she found a new purpose in life by recommitting herself to her family. The turning point came when a female doctor took her by the shoulders and told her to pull herself together. She still had a family to take care of. Valentina took those words to heart. There was also another episode that helped her survive the crisis. "I am very grateful to a simple woman from Pripyat," she recalled. "Once, when I was walking from the bus stop and sobbing, she came up to me, embraced me and said, 'Valyusha, why are you crying? After all, Victor is alive, and that's the main thing. Just look how many graves there are after Chernobyl.'" Valentina would now fight not only for herself but also for her husband. She convinced him to get a lawyer. At first, depressed and fatalistic, he had refused to do even that. The trial, originally planned for the spring of 1987, had been postponed because of the unstable mental condition of one of the accused, the former chief engineer Nikolai Fomin. He had been arrested on August 13th, 1986, the same day as Brukhanov. This was shortly after his release from Hospital No. 6 in Moscow, where he had been treated for radiation poisoning. The trauma of the arrest, coupled with the effects of acute radiation syndrome, drove Fomin to depression. In March 1987, while in prison, he broke his eyeglasses and tried to cut his veins with the shards. The doctors saved him, and by July 1987, they had made him sufficiently stable to face trial. In the hall of the Chernobyl Cultural Center, Brukhanov and Fomin were seated on either side of the man considered by many to be the true cause of the catastrophe. Fomin's deputy, Anatoly Dyatlov, who had been in charge of the ill-fated turbine test on the night of the explosion. Like Fomin, Dyatlov had been treated in Hospital No. 6, but he had not been released until early November 1986. The doctors estimated that he had absorbed 390 rem. He left the hospital with open wounds on his legs, the result of radioactive burns sustained on the night of April the 26th. From the start, in the eyes of the criminal investigators, Dyatlov was the main culprit of the disaster. They also opened criminal investigations of the chief of the Unit 4 shift, Alexander Akimov, and the reactor operator, Leonid Toptunov, but had to close them because of the deaths of both in May 1986. Dyatlov was ill but still alive. He was arrested on December the 4th, a month to the day after his release from the hospital. In June 1987, when everything was ready for the trial, Brukhanov, Fomin and Dyatlov were moved from the KGB prison in Kiev to the regional prison in Ivankiv, a town 50 kilometers south of Chernobyl that served as headquarters of the State Commission dealing with the consequences of the disaster. From there they would be taken daily to Chernobyl for sessions of the trial. Brukhanov and his former subordinates were accused of violating 3 articles of the Soviet-Ukrainian Criminal Code. The first dealt with safety rules at enterprises subject to explosion hazards. The second with abuse of power, which allegedly manifested itself in withholding information about the true scope of the accident, and the third with negligence, as a result of which the managers supposedly failed to train plant personnel properly. Viktor Brukhanov refused to plead guilty to the first 2 charges. He claimed that no instruction had ever defined a nuclear plant as an enterprise subject to explosion hazards. Neither lawmakers nor industry leaders who issued operating instructions had contemplated the notion that a reactor might explode. On the second count, he claimed that he informed the authorities of what was going on at the power plant to the best of his ability, but his suggestion to evacuate the population of Pripyat had been ignored. The most damning evidence against him was the letter he had signed on the morning of April the 26th, giving the lowest level of radiation at the power plant from the readings then available to him. To the prosecutor's question, why was there no information about 200 rontgens per hour in the letter to party and Soviet organs, Brukhanov responded, "I looked at the letter inattentively. Of course that should have been added." Although Brukhanov tried to defend himself as best he could, he knew that whatever he said or did at the trial, his fate had already been decided in Moscow. "It was apparent beforehand that I would be punished," he said later, recalling his thoughts at the time of the trial. Brukhanov admitted that he was guilty of negligence, as the accident had happened on his watch. "I am guilty as manager of having missed something, of having been careless or inefficient in some way. I understand that this is a serious accident, but everyone bears some blame for it," he told the court. Brukhanov's assumption of partial responsibility for the accident made a positive impression on the judges, although everyone knew that he had not been directly involved in the events of April the 26th. "You know, this is my first encounter with such a calm, self-possessed defendant," one of the judges said privately to Valentina Brukhanova, "although you can feel that he's upset. A real man." Nikolai Fomin adopted a completely different strategy. Saved and brought back to life by prison doctors after his botched suicide attempt, he was now fully revived and not above shifting responsibility for the accident to his subordinates. His line of defense was quite simple. The program of the turbine test he had approved was sound, and the explosion at Unit 4 would never have taken place if Dyatlov and Akimov had followed it. "I'm convinced that it was not the program that caused the accident," he told the court. When the prosecutor asked, "Who, in your opinion, is mainly responsible for the accident?" Fomin responded, "Dyatlov and Akimov, who allowed deviations from the program." Anatoly Dyatlov, the manager directly responsible for the violation of conditions for the turbine test set by the program, refused to take a page from Fomin's book and blame his subordinates, who by that time were deceased and might well have been made the ultimate scapegoats. Dyatlov chose a different and much nobler course, but one that was also dangerous for the authorities. He admitted guilt for a number of violations of the operating instructions, such as leaving fewer than 15 control rods in the active zone of the reactor failing to restore the power level of the reactor to 700 megawatts of thermal energy, MWT, after the accidental loss of power, as suggested by the test program, and delaying the use of the emergency shutdown, AZ5 button, to stop the reaction. But Dyatlov was adamant that none of those violations would have caused the explosion if the reactor had been in sound operating condition. If we had pressed the button earlier, the accident would have taken place earlier, argued Dyatlov. That is to say, the accident was conditioned by the state of the reactor. I gave the order to stop the power level of the reactor at 200 megawatts of thermal energy, since I considered that the reactor met the safety standards accepted in the USSR. In effect, Dyatlov was pointing a finger at the designers of the RBMK reactors, which turned out to be anything but explosion-proof because of their positive void effect, meaning their capacity to accelerate a reaction when control rods were inserted into the active zone. Dyatlov was going public with an accusation against the designers of the reactor that many in the industry and the political elite knew to be justified. Dyatlov eventually concluded that neither the principal presiding judge, a member of the Soviet Supreme Court, Raymond Brizye, nor the main prosecutor, Yuri Shadrin, a senior aide to the general prosecutor of the Soviet Union, was interested in uncovering the truth about the explosion. Indeed, they shielded the designers of the RBMK reactors from responsibility by removing all materials pertaining to reactor design from the case against the plant managers and assigning them to a separate criminal case requiring further investigation. The commission of nuclear experts summoned by the court to look into the causes of the explosion was dominated by representatives of the institutions responsible for the design of the RBMK reactors, and evidence given by witnesses from among the operators and engineers of the Chernobyl nuclear plant was often ignored by the judges. Brukhanov believed that the new management of the station deliberately called a meeting of senior personnel at the plant to coincide with the reading of the trial's verdict in order to avoid a scandalous protest against it. Nonetheless, more than 500 employees of the plant signed an appeal to pardon Brukhanov. As Dyatlov later wrote, by July 1987, it had become clear to many that bringing charges against personnel was illegitimate. The witnesses knew what measures were being taken to modernize the remaining reactors, considered them, and drew their own conclusions. He was referring to the modifications made to RBMK reactors after the Politburo meeting of July 1986. Well aware that responsibility for the disaster could not be ascribed solely to the operators and designers, the senior authorities decided to make them scapegoats nevertheless. Commenting subsequently on the verdict, Brukhanov observed, "After all, it was necessary to show the Central Committee of the party and the whole world, look, we've found the culprit. And how could science be lagging behind in the Soviet Union? It was the best in the world." The court ruled that Brukhanov and his subordinates were guilty because they had not ensured that the power station personnel would observe technological discipline. Moreover, they themselves systematically violated official instructions and ignored the directions of supervisory organs. Brukhanov was also blamed for delays in the evacuation of personnel. Having manifested confusion and cowardice, Brukhanov did not take measures to limit the scope of the accident, did not implement a plan to protect the personnel and the population from radioactive emissions, and in the information he presented, deliberately minimized the data on radiation levels, which hindered the timely evacuation of people from the danger zone, read the verdict. When the judge read out the verdict, Brukhanov was shocked by the severity of the punishment meted out to him. 10 years of incarceration, the same as the sentence given to Dyatlov and Fomin. Ultimately, it did not matter what the 3 top managers had done at the time of the accident or what attitude they took in court. All were sentenced to the same term. 3 other defendants received sentences ranging from 2 to 5 years of imprisonment. The judge of the Supreme Court rendered the verdict that he was ordered to give, said Brukhanov in retrospect. I think that if they had found an article whereby I could have been shot, they would have shot me, but they didn't find it. The prison authorities suspected that because the sentence came as a shock, Brukhanov might commit suicide. On the night after the verdict, a guard placed a chair by my bed and spent the whole night there, lest I do something to myself, recalled Brukhanov. But he only interfered with my sleep. Brukhanov had no thought of killing himself. He was cut from different cloth. As he later told a journalist, leaving this life is simple enough. But what would you prove by doing so? And to whom? What would it accomplish? Not everyone was so resilient. Valery Legasov succeeded in his second suicide attempt on April the 27th, 1988, one day after the second anniversary of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. He hanged himself in his own apartment when the members of his family left for work. There was no mistaking the seriousness of his intent. The knot on the rope was so tight that even the police officers who investigated his death found it difficult to untangle. Legasov left no suicide note, but put in order the verses he had dedicated to his wife over his lifetime. On the previous day he had brought home personal items from his office, including his favorite photo of 2 Chernobyl storks, a symbol of life returning to the disaster area. Since his first suicide attempt in the summer of 1987, Legasov had been attempting to put his life back on track, dedicating himself to his new obsession, the security of Soviet nuclear reactors. In October 1987, he wrote an article for Pravda arguing the priority of science over the demands of industry and production quotas. When it became necessary not to improve on the old but to create the new, the voice of principle was accorded to science, maintained Legasov, presenting an idealized picture of the early development of the Soviet nuclear program. He continued, and then there is the opposite example, so tragically demonstrated in Chernobyl, when science was constrained and decisions that were less than optimal began to be made. Legasov tried to be as diplomatic as possible in his criticism of the Soviet nuclear industry, but his diplomacy did not work as planned. In the fall of 1987, he was subjected to yet another humiliation. Anatoly Alexandrov, who had kept on supporting Legasov, announced to the staff of the Kurchatov Institute that the Politburo had decided to bestow the highest Soviet peacetime award, the Star of Hero of Socialist Labor, on Legasov for his work at Chernobyl. But the Politburo decision was reversed at the last moment, apparently by Gorbachev himself. It was a severe blow to Legasov's prestige and morale. His health was failing and his hopes for the realization of his scientific plans were fading with it. On April the 26th, 1988, the second anniversary of the Chernobyl accident, Legasov's colleagues in the Academy of Sciences rejected a new idea of his, that of creating an interagency committee on chemical research. On that day he removed his personal effects, including the Chernobyl photos, from his office. A day later, he was dead. In the period leading up to his death, Legasov had begun to question perestroika, Gorbachev's policies aimed at the transformation of Soviet society. He told one of his colleagues that he believed the wrong people were in charge. It is hard to imagine that he had anyone other than Gorbachev himself in mind. In the interviews and memoirs about Chernobyl that Legasov recorded on tape during the months prior to his suicide, he expressed concern about the security record of the nuclear industry. He was critical of many features of the RBMK reactors built in the USSR, especially the lack of a concrete shelter above the reactor, which was required by international standards in hopes of preventing the spread of radiation in the case of an accident. In his view, the regulation of reactor activity by means of control rods with graphite components was inadequate. Legasov was critical of the all-powerful Minister of Medium Machine Building, Yefim Slavsky, but had good things to say about Premier Nikolai Ryzhkov, who had supported him as he worked on his report for the International Atomic Energy Agency conference in Vienna in the summer of 1986. It was Ryzhkov who attended Legasov's funeral on behalf of the Soviet leadership. Gorbachev was nowhere to be seen. Valery Legasov, who had told the world much of the truth about the consequences of the Chernobyl disaster in his Vienna report, but would not tell the whole truth about its causes, was now dead, crushed by radiation-induced depression that heightened his sense of betrayal and guilt. Viktor Brukhanov, Nikolai Fomin, Anatoly Dyatlov, and 3 of their colleagues from the management of the Chernobyl nuclear plant were serving time in prison. As far as Soviet public opinion was concerned, Legasov's death was an unfortunate accident, while the guilty were being justly punished. With the reactor buried and the uncomfortable truth about the explosion apparently buried with it, Mikhail Gorbachev was finally able to launch his political and economic reforms. The future looked promising, if not entirely bright. Unanticipated by many in Moscow and in other capitals all over the world, the Chernobyl disaster would come back in a most unexpected way to affect the lives of those already influenced by it.